So today I'm doing a video on changing the impeller in my Mercury Pro kicker, and it's a 9.9, and I went to the dealership and picked up a impeller. This is the impeller they say it should be, and I like to use the name brand in this. Just I saw them quite cheap on Amazon, and they're knockoff brands, and I just wouldn't trust these rubber things on a knockoff, potentially like failing and going into the motor and causing some more damage. So this thing at $50 Canadian was a lot more expensive than the knockoffs on Amazon, and you can get it in a kit that includes a metal plate and a couple other parts for like $160 Canadian. And normally you don't need those other parts because they're fine. In fact, usually this thing is fine as well. Unless you're running it in a river where there's lots of sand or something like that, you might want to take, to replace those other parts. But because I don't do that, I'm just going to replace this. And like I say, normally that's all you need to do. So I'm going to just go over a few things that I saw. I looked at other videos online and they kind of left out a few things. So the shifter here, you want it to be in neutral, and you want it to be just in the center of neutral. And you can see the shifter shaft coming down here, and that goes up and down, and it goes right into the lower leg here. So this is going to have to be disconnected, but you want to keep it in the middle position. You want to take this retainer off. We'll take those off and separate it, but you just want to get this to the point where it just barely separates. You can do that by pushing it sideways as you're backing this one off until it just barely separates, because you want to put it back to exactly where it was. Now you can use this to adjust where the neutral position is. Like sometimes if you have it in gear and you can hear it clicking away, then you might not have it in exactly the right spot, and you can use that to adjust it, because you can adjust the length of this shaft, these two shafts, by putting them more or less inside this long nut here. But if it's working now, try to put it exactly back the way that it was. So I'm going to take this off, move it down, then I'm going to back this off until it just disconnects. I'll even count the number of turns maybe to do that, so that when I put it back, it'll go exactly the way. This is a jam nut. That jam nut has to be loosened off before this is going to turn easily. We'll take this, open this up and move it down here, and then there's essentially just 4 more bolts down here that you need to take out. 2 on this side, 2 on, actually they're nuts, 2 on this side, 2 on the other side, and then it should pull down. And because we've got it in neutral, spinning this isn't going to spin the drive shaft that goes up in there, because if we spin the drive shaft, then the spline isn't going to be perfectly lined up anymore when we're trying to put it back together. So ideally when we take it apart, we're going to not spin the spline. It's not so important on this one, whereas on my 150 over there, it's got a spline for the shifter and for the drive shaft, and if you get those misaligned, it can be tricky to get the thing back together, because you can't engage the splines very easily. So it's best to just try and put it back together. Take it apart and put it back together exactly the way that it came. Okay, so I'm going to start to take these things apart. I'll show you after I've taken it apart. So there's the shift cable, wire, shaft, or whatever you want to call it. And I used a small wrench, this guy on here, to back that off, but I had to hold that one with a crescent wrench, small crescent wrench, but if you have another wrench, that'll do too. So you hold that one stationary, crack that one off, and back it off. This thing's already been shifted down. You can see that there's a small gap between the shafts. If that gap is different when you put it back together, then your shifter won't be shifting correctly. So this is the neutral position. That gap there should be the same when I put it back together. Now I could measure that, but I'm just not gonna at all play with this shaft down here. I don't want to push it in or out, and I'm not gonna shift this guy up here, so that hopefully when I put it back together, I'm gonna give it a visual. I'm gonna put it back together, and hopefully it should be good. If it's not, then you will have to adjust this gap or play around with it until you get it in neutral. When this is reading neutral, it can be a bit fussy, so best to just put it back the same way. So here we go. These nuts came off pretty easily. I've already cracked them all, and now I can just take them right out. I'm going to take them right out, And as I do, this thing's going to want to drop down, so I might have to, I'll probably leave one nut on. Get them all cracked, leave one nut on, take 3 off. That way if it tries to drop on you, you'll know when it is. It's when you take off the last nut. Okay, I might have to tilt the motor up because when I'm not sure how far this comes down before it disengages, so I'll just give it a try. So I took the 3 nuts completely off, and you can see I've left the 1 nut in here, and I was backing it off, and I've left it, you know, a little bit engaged, but I've separated this, let it just drop down nicely, but you might have to tap it with a plastic hammer to get it to come down. But I left it there because I want to take these things off now. I want to take these things off because they have to fit through this shaft has to go through this hole in order to take this thing apart. So now I've got enough room here that I can push this sideways a little bit, take these things off, and I'll have to remember to do this in reverse when I put it back together. So I did have to tilt it up a bit in order for the shaft to come out through the bottom, because it's actually quite long. Here's the spline. Usually we just put a dab of grease on that, triple guard or something like that when we put it back in. And here's the shifter shaft. And remember, we don't want to pull that in or out. And this is the housing I'm going to take apart. And there's three bolts holding that on. Pretty simple. I'll take it off, show you what's in there in a bit. So this housing was stuck on there just a little bit, as to be expected. So all I did was take a nice big wrench, get it under this edge here, and just crack it. So there's the housing. I've taken it off, and you can see the plate underneath. You want to take a look and see if this stainless steel is scratched at all. This is the part that would come with the kit. This is in really nice shape. There wasn't a lot of hours on this, and never used in sand, so it's in good condition. And then there's this seal here that needs to be in good condition too. These 2 things in the kit would cost 3 times the cost if it came with those. So it's worthwhile, like, even taking this thing apart and looking to see whether you need them before you go down there and buy the replacement part. Then you actually have the replacement part in hand to see whether it matches too, if the dealer's close. Another thing you want to do is just look at the way that these blades are bent on the one that's in there. You want to put the new one back in the same orientation. Oh, it looks a little gefunkled in there, but I'm going to go with rotating it into the right when I put in the new one to make sure that it's the blades are in the right orientation. But I think generally you power this thing up, those blades are eventually going to end up in the right orientation, but I just like to try and match it up. So another thing you'll notice is that there's this little keyway here. That would actually be in the replacement kit for the 3 times the cost as well. So usually these things aren't any problem, but you can see if you lost this sucker, that wouldn't be good. It has to be keyed into the slot in the impeller, and you can see the slot there. Now I'm going to rotate that slot so that it's in about the right orientation that this thing is in, so that when I put it back together, I'll hopefully be 99% there and just be able to shift it. And I did put a little bit of O-ring lube on this guy here, just so that when it first starts up, it was pretty dry rubber. And I know that the O-ring lube isn't going to attack the rubber, so and I also put some in this hole here, so that when it goes back into the tube on the inside of the motor, that has to be lined up when you put it back in, that it'll slide into that quite nicely because it was dry too. So now I'm just going to try and put that sucker back together. There it is back together. One note here is that this is a plastic housing, so it's going to be a lot more squishy than metal. So you just want to get these snug. Make sure that you're seated up here, and then just another quarter turn past snug. Something that feels good, but you can crack this housing if you go too far on that, so you don't want to do that. So I did put a little bit of grease on the spline at the top. Usually they recommend that. I don't think there's a lot of relative motion in operation between the 2 male and female splines, but couldn't hurt. There might be a seal at the bottom that I'm also lubricating. that's in the motor. I'm going to put this thing back in. Remember, I'm going to put it in until I can just get one nut threaded, and then I'm going to put these back on before I put it in the rest of the way. So there's my one nut on, and it slid in pretty nicely. Remember, I didn't rotate the drive shaft, so that spline on the drive shaft should have stayed lined up with the spline on the motor. Now, if you rotated that some little bit, then that spline is going to be hitting. It's not going to be lined up with the spline on top, and you might have to take it apart a little bit, rotate it, and put it back in. But it should just slide in nicely. What some other guys will do is if you're really having difficulties, and this is kind of where things start to go south if you've been playing around with things, is that you can shift it into gear and then rotate the propeller a little bit while you're pushing it in until the spline lines up. But then you remember you have to shift it back into neutral before you hook this guy up. Otherwise, your gear neutral position is going to be all screwed up. So with my one nut holding it apart, I have now put on the retaining plastic thing and the long nut there all the way. Now I'm going to continue to put the rest of the nuts on and tighten it in fully, and then we can go through and put that on. So I put all those nuts on there, and I tightened them all up, and I just kind of gave them a little bit of a, you don't have to pull them too tight, but I did go around and snug them up first, give them a little bit of a tightening, then go around them like you would a head gasket or something like that. In other words, not just cranking one up and then the next one, then the next one. Kind of go around a little bit, just because that's good practice. There's no gasket involved in this, so it's probably not as fussy as if there was gasket, but generally speaking, it's better. So now that we're tight at the bottom, I'm going to be putting this back together. I'm just eyeballing that gap that we talked about earlier. It does seem to be about the right size, which is good. I'm going to put this nut on. This nut is exactly in the same position as it was before. Drive this on, and then I'm going to shift it a few times, and I'll spin the propeller just as it goes into gear to see whether it's actually locking into gear in the right spots. And then I'll run it up, because you don't want to find out on the water that something's screwy. So there, I've put it back together, the shifter shaft, and this is a jam nut onto this longer nut here, which is the adjustment nut. And this guy here is an additional retainer, which in theory you don't need if you've got a jam nut properly tightened, but I guess they've had some problems with these coming loose, and they've added this extra thing. This thing is 100% plastic, and the screw that was in there it's a clearance on this side and threaded into the plastic on the other side, and that stripped out instantly. It was, I'm going with it was already stripped. But what I did was I put in an 832 new screw that I happen to have. You want it to be 316 if you're going to do this, 316 stainless steel, and it fit perfectly, tapped itself a new set of threads, and you just want to tighten it until it's just snug. I mean, you just want to feel that this thing's not spinning around, so that it can't go up and down, but it's snug. Otherwise, when you're tightening that, it's not much difference between tight and stripped. Otherwise, you got to get a new one, or do what I did and put in a new fastener. But not everybody has a bin of fasteners like I do. So there it is. Now I'm just going to make sure that my shift lever is still the way that it should be. Now, I was pretty careful not to play around with the shaft lengths and all that sort of stuff and shift, and I tried not to shift this, and I tried not to pull this guy here, so in theory it should be just right. So I'm just going to give it a spin with my foot. You can see that it's in neutral, and I'm just going to shift it just a little bit into reverse. There. So now it's in reverse, back into neutral. There's neutral. And yes, you can see that it's not clickety-clicketing. And into forward. It's forward. I'm going to try this when it's running too. That's neutral. But if you hear any clicking, then you have to adjust this. So here is the old impeller, just out of your curiosity. You can see these little flat sections. I'll get the light just right there and right there. Those flat sections are the only wear that I can see on the actual blades. There's no cracks or anything like that. The top ceiling features these little ridges. Those things look pretty good on one side. On the other side, you know, they're a little bit questionable. This thing, it was pissing water quite nicely, so there was no problem with the cooling or anything like that. But I suppose if you're on a budget, you could just put this thing back in and pull it out every year or two to just monitor it. But I just figured I'd replace the whole thing, and for just this one part, a little peace of mind out there. I go trolling, so this thing can work for hours and hours. But yeah, that doesn't look too bad. And I've never seen one of these things break down. Well, apparently they do. They'd probably have to be left in for a very long time, or run without water. That would do it too. So I just started it up for the first time. You can see it's a pretty strong stream here. That should be a nice strong stream. Everything else seems to be looking good. Just going to check the shifter. You can see the blade down there while I shift it from neutral to forward, back into neutral, reverse. Everything seems to be working. Sometimes you would have to find out that it's making a clicking sound here, which would mean that it's just barely trying to go into gear, which would require you to readjust that